And the January 27th, 1943, Naval Air Station Peleliu, Solomon Islands. The sun hung low over the coral airstrip, bleeding orange across the Pacific horizon. Salt spray drifted inland from breaking waves, coating everything in a fine white residue that crusted on metal and skin alike. In the maintenance tent beneath canvas stretched tight against the tropical wind, a Navy mechanic named Charles Stoll knelt beside the nose of a Vought F4U Corsair, his hands black with grease, his eyes fixed on the massive four-bladed propeller that dominated the aircraft's profile like the petals of some mechanical flower. The propeller measured 13 feet, 4 inches across. Each blade was carved from solid aluminum alloy, shaped and balanced with such precision that even a quarter-ounce difference could tear the engine apart at combat speed. Stoll had been staring at these blades for 3 hours. Around him, other mechanics worked on different aircraft, their voices a low murmur beneath the rhythmic clang of wrenches and the distant drone of fighters returning from patrol. But Stoll heard none of it. He was listening to something else, a vibration, a resonance that shouldn't exist, a phantom frequency that haunted the Corsair like a ghost in the machine. The F4U had arrived at forward bases 6 months earlier with a reputation that preceded it like thunder. On paper, it was magnificent. 2,400 horsepower Pratt & Whitney double wasp engine, inverted gull wings that gave it the silhouette of a predatory bird, 6 150 caliber Browning machine guns that could shred a zero in seconds. Vought engineers had promised 400 miles per hour in level flight, but the aircraft delivered only 350, maybe 360 on a good day with a tailwind. Worse, it shook. At high speed, the entire airframe vibrated with such violence that pilots reported blurred vision, numbed hands, instruments becoming unreadable. 2 pilots had already died when structural fatigue caused mid-air failures. Stoll reached forward and placed his palm flat against the propeller hub. He could feel it, the wrongness, the dissonance. Metal should not speak like this. His father had been a machinist in Cleveland, a man who taught his son that every object has a voice, a frequency, a truth it tells through vibration and heat. Stoll had carried that knowledge through tech school, through basic training, through 10 months in the Pacific where he'd learned that the difference between living and dying often came down to understanding what machines were trying to say. He stood, wiped his hands on a rag already stiff with dried oil, and walked to the parts shed where the spare propeller blades stood racked like swords. Something was wrong with the pitch mechanism, he was certain now. Not the pitch range itself. The technical specifications there were sound, but the transition between pitch angles, the way the blades moved through the air at high velocity, the E.M. Hamilton standard propellers had been designed for optimal performance, variable pitch mechanisms that adjusted blade angle automatically based on airspeed and engine RPM. But Stoll suspected the optimal settings existed only in wind tunnels, in controlled environments where air behaved according to equations. Combat was different. Combat air was thick with humidity, turbulent with thermals rising from jungle canopies, disrupted by the shock waves of nearby aircraft and the concussive blast of anti-aircraft fire. What the Corsair needed, Stoll believed, was not perfection. It needed adaptation. The Vought F4U Corsair had been born from desperation and ambition in equal measure. In 1938, with war already consuming China and Europe preparing for catastrophe, the United States Navy issued a requirement for a carrier-based fighter capable of matching or exceeding any aircraft the Japanese or Germans could field. The specifications were brutal: 400 miles per hour, range exceeding 1,000 miles, firepower sufficient to destroy bombers, and the structural strength to survive carrier landings that routinely destroyed lesser aircraft. Vought aircraft responded with a design so radical it seemed almost reckless. Chief designer Rex Beisel proposed mounting the largest engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp, 18 cylinders generating 2,400 horsepower, into the smallest, lightest airframe possible. The problem was immediate and obvious. Such a massive engine required a propeller over 13 feet in diameter to convert all that power into thrust. But a 13-foot propeller could not fit on a conventional aircraft design without either placing the cockpit impossibly high or creating landing gear so long they would collapse under the stress of carrier landings. Basil's solution was the inverted gull wing, a distinctive design where the wings angled downward from the fuselage before bending upward at the wing root. This allowed shorter, stronger landing gear while still providing propeller clearance. It gave the Corsair its unmistakable profile, predatory and strange, like something that had evolved for a different sky. Pilots called it bent wing bird, hognose, and less flattering names when its quirks nearly killed them. The prototype first flew on May 29, 1940 from Stratford, Connecticut. Test pilot Lyman A. Bullard climbed to 15,000 feet, leveled off, and pushed the throttle forward. The Corsair accelerated like no aircraft he had ever flown, the ocean blurring beneath him, the airframe singing with speed. For 3 minutes, everything was perfect. Then, as he passed 390 miles per hour, the aircraft began to shake. At 405 miles per hour, the vibration became so severe that Bullard thought the wings would tear off. He pulled back the throttle, descended, landed with his hands still trembling. Engineers analyzed the flight data and identified compressibility effects, the air around the propeller tips approaching supersonic velocity, creating shock waves that disrupted airflow across the entire aircraft. They adjusted the propeller design, modified the blade profiles, recalculated pitch settings. The shaking diminished, but never disappeared. When the Navy accepted the F4U into production in 1942, it came with a warning: do not exceed 400 miles per hour in a sustained dive. Pilots were advised to make all high-speed attacks in short bursts, to pull out early, to accept that the aircraft's theoretical maximum speed was a boundary they should approach with caution. By early 1943, when Charles Stoll knelt beside that propeller in the Solomon Islands, the Corsair had accumulated a peculiar reputation. It was fast, but not as fast as promised. It was powerful, but temperamental. It killed experienced pilots during routine carrier landings because the long nose blocked forward visibility and the aircraft dropped like a stone when power was reduced. The Navy, frustrated by these characteristics, began reassigning Corsairs to Marine Corps squadrons operating from land bases, where the demanding carrier landing requirements didn't apply. Marine pilots, desperate for anything that could match the nimble Japanese Zero, accepted the aircraft with gratitude and trepidation. They learned its moods, its violence, its hunger for altitude and speed. They learned to love it and fear it simultaneously. But they also learned that something was missing, some final optimization that the engineers in Connecticut had failed to discover. The Corsair was holding back, keeping some reserve of performance locked away behind mechanical limitations no one had yet identified. Charles Stoll believed he had found it. The propeller pitch settings were optimized for climbing and cruising, for the mission profiles outlined in the manual. But combat demanded something different: rapid acceleration in level flight, maximum speed during pursuit, the ability to close distance with an enemy aircraft before it could escape into cloud cover or the protective embrace of its own formation. The current settings prioritized efficiency over aggression. What if, Stoll wondered, you reverse that priority? He began with careful measurement. Using tools borrowed from the engineering section, Stoll documented the exact pitch angles of the propeller at various RPM settings. Hamilton Standard's mechanism operated hydraulically, engine oil pressure pushing against a piston that rotated the blades within their hub. At low speed, the blades sat at a high angle nearly perpendicular to the airflow, to bite deep and pull the aircraft forward. As speed increased, the mechanism gradually decreased the pitch angle, flattening the blades to reduce drag and maintain propeller efficiency as the aircraft accelerated. The problem, Stoll realized, was in the transition curve. The pitch change happened too slowly during acceleration, which meant the propeller blades remained at suboptimal angles for several seconds while the aircraft tried to convert engine power into forward speed. During those seconds, energy was wasted, translated into vibration and heat rather than velocity. By the time the pitch mechanism finally caught up with the aircraft's speed, the opportunity for maximum acceleration had passed. What the Corsair needed was an aggressive initial pitch reduction, a sharp transition that decreased blade angle more rapidly during the critical acceleration phase when pilots were pushing the throttle forward and demanding everything the engine could give. This would create a brief period where the propeller operated slightly outside its efficiency curve, but that sacrifice would be rewarded with faster acceleration and higher terminal velocity. The risk was significant. Adjusting propeller pitch settings without extensive testing could destroy the engine, cause catastrophic blade failure, or create even worse vibration that would shake the aircraft apart in flight. These were not weekend mechanics adjustments. Propeller systems were calibrated at the factory using precision equipment, then validated through hundreds of hours of flight testing. Charles Stoll, a 24-year-old Navy mechanic working with hand tools in a canvas tent on a jungle island, was proposing to modify a system that dozens of engineers with advanced degrees had spent years perfecting. He did it anyway. Working after dark, using portable lights that cast harsh shadows across the propeller hub, Stoll disassembled the pitch control mechanism. The hydraulic piston that governed blade angle was regulated by a series of springs and stops that determined how quickly the mechanism could respond to changes in engine RPM and oil pressure. By carefully adjusting the spring tensions and modifying the mechanical stops, Stoll altered the response curve. He made the pitch reduction more aggressive at the low end, allowing the blades to flatten more quickly during initial acceleration, then maintained the standard curve for high-speed cruise and dive operations. The modifications took 3 nights. On the 4th morning, January 21, 1943, Stoll approached Lieutenant Howard Bauer, a Marine pilot with 16 confirmed kills and a reputation for flying aircraft that other pilots refused to touch. Bauer listened to Stoll's explanation with the patient expression of someone who had heard many confident predictions about miracle modifications that never worked. "You're telling me," Bauer said slowly, "that you can make this thing faster by fiddling with the propeller." "Not fiddling, sir. Optimizing. And this optimization, which the engineers at Vought somehow missed, you figured out in a maintenance tent." "Yes, sir." "By yourself?" "Yes, sir." Bauer looked at the Corsair, at the propeller that dominated its profile. He had flown the F4U for 4 months, had learned to respect its power and curse its limitations. He had been in situations where an extra 20 miles per hour would have meant the difference between destroying an enemy bomber and watching it escape. He thought about those moments, weighed them against the risk of testing an unauthorized modification, and made his decision. "If this kills me," Bauer said, "I'm going to be extremely disappointed in you." "Understood, sir. And if it works, you're buying the first round when we get back to civilization." "Deal, sir." They ran the test at dawn when the air was cool and dense, when any problems would be easier to control. Bauer taxied to the end of the coral strip, ran through his pre-flight checks, and pushed the throttle forward. The Corsair accelerated down the runway, its massive propeller chewing through air, the inverted gull wings flexing slightly as they began to generate lift. Bauer felt the aircraft leave the ground, felt the landing gear folding into the wings, felt the transition from earthbound machine to something wild and airborne. He climbed to 5,000 feet and leveled off. Behind him, on the ground, Charles Stoll stood beside the runway with stopwatch and binoculars, his heart hammering in his chest. If the propeller failed, if a blade separated at high speed, Bauer would have perhaps 3 seconds to react before the aircraft tore itself apart. Stoll had done the calculations, had checked his modifications a dozen times, but there was no certainty in mechanical systems, only probability and hope. Bauer pushed the throttle to full combat power and felt the Corsair surge forward. The acceleration was immediate, aggressive, like something had been unleashed that had been held back before. The vibration he had grown accustomed to, the steady buzz that turned instruments into blurred approximations, was noticeably reduced. The aircraft felt solid, planted, certain. The airspeed indicator climbed through 350 miles per hour, 360, 370. At 380 miles per hour, Bauer felt something change. The propeller bite, the way it grabbed air and translated power into motion, suddenly became smoother, more efficient. The nose dropped slightly as the aircraft tried to accelerate even faster. He trimmed to maintain level flight and watched the airspeed indicator continue climbing. 390, 400, 410. At 417 miles per hour, the needle stopped climbing, having reached the maximum speed the engine could sustain in level flight. Bauer held that speed for 30 seconds, feeling the aircraft beneath him, listening to the engine note, monitoring every instrument for signs of stress or failure. Everything remained solid. The Corsair was not just fast now, it was effortlessly fast, as if some internal resistance had been removed and the aircraft was finally expressing its true nature. He descended, flew a series of aggressive maneuvers to test the propeller response during rapid throttle changes and combat-style turns. Every transition was smooth, precise, powerful. The modifications had worked. More than worked. They had transformed the aircraft from something good into something exceptional. When Bauer landed and taxied back to the maintenance area, Charles Stoll was waiting. The mechanic's face was carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed him. Hope and terror mixed in equal measure. Bauer cut the engine, climbed down from the cockpit, and walked over to where Stoll stood. For a moment, he said nothing, just looked at the younger man with an expression that could have meant anything. Then he smiled. 417 miles per hour, Bauer said quietly. Sustained. Level flight. Stoll felt something in his chest relax, some tension he hadn't known he was carrying. The vibration? Barely noticeable. Feels like a different aircraft. Bauer paused, then extended his hand. Whatever you did, it worked. When we get back to Hawaii, I'm writing this up. This needs to go fleet-wide. Word spread through the Solomon Islands bases like fire through dry grass. By the end of January, 3 more Corsairs had received Stoll's modifications. By mid-February, every F4U in the theater had been upgraded. Pilots reported similar results. 50 to 60 miles per hour increase in maximum speed, reduced vibration, improved acceleration in combat situations. The Corsair, already respected, became something else, a predator that could run down any Japanese aircraft in the sky. The Japanese pilots noticed immediately. They had developed tactics specifically for dealing with American fighters. The Zero's superior maneuverability meant that any dogfight would eventually favor the Japanese pilot if he could just survive the initial engagement and force the fight into a low-speed turning contest. Against the Thunderbolt and the Wildcat, this strategy worked well enough. Against the modified Corsair, it became suicide. American pilots adopted what became known as boom and zoom tactics, diving from altitude at maximum speed, firing a burst that could destroy the target in seconds, then using the Corsair's superior speed to climb back to altitude before the Zeros could react. The Japanese called these attacks lightning strikes, sudden violence that came from nowhere and disappeared before defense was possible. 0 pilots who survived described the sensation of helplessness, of being hunted by something faster and more powerful than themselves, of watching American fighters accelerate away with contemptuous ease whenever the combat situation turned unfavorable. Lieutenant Ira Kepford, flying from Bougainville in March 1943, recorded in his diary, "The modified Corsair is not just faster, it's confidently faster. You know, absolutely, that no enemy aircraft can catch you if you decide to disengage. That knowledge changes everything. You attack with complete aggression because you always have an escape route. The Japanese know it too. You can see it in how they fly now, more defensive, more cautious. They're not hunting anymore. They're being hunted." By April, intelligence officers were documenting a shift in Japanese tactical doctrine. Rather than seeking engagement with American fighters, Japanese pilots were prioritizing survival, attempting to complete their missions and return to base while avoiding combat whenever possible. This was psychological warfare conducted through mechanical superiority. The simple knowledge that American fighters were faster eroded Japanese pilot morale as effectively as actual combat losses. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics initially responded to reports of Stoll's modifications with skepticism bordering on hostility. These were unauthorized changes to flight-critical systems made without proper engineering review or safety testing. If the modifications had failed and killed pilots, Stoll would have faced court-martial. But the modifications hadn't failed. They worked consistently across hundreds of aircraft and thousands of flight hours. By June 1943, the Bureau grudgingly admitted that a 24-year-old mechanic working in a tent had discovered something their engineers had missed. The official explanation, when it finally came, was elegant in its simplicity. The original propeller pitch settings had been optimized for carrier operations, where aircraft typically catapulted from flight decks already moving at 30 miles per hour and needed rapid climb performance to clear the carrier superstructure. Stoll's modifications, by contrast, optimized for land-based operations where the aircraft began from a standing start and needed maximum acceleration in level flight. The different mission profiles required different pitch curves. It was obvious in retrospect, which is how all great insights appear once someone else has pointed them out. Hamilton Standard, the propeller manufacturer, incorporated Stoll's modifications into their production specifications. By August 1943, every new Corsair rolling off assembly lines in Connecticut and Texas came equipped with what engineers now called combat-optimized pitch progression. The modification added nothing to the cost, required no exotic materials or complex manufacturing processes. It was simply a better understanding of how propellers should behave in combat conditions, knowledge bought with Charles Stoll's intuition and Lieutenant Bauer's courage. The implications rippled outward in ways that transcended simple velocity measurements. The 50-mile-per-hour speed increase meant that Corsair formations could cover larger areas, could respond to threats more quickly, could intercept enemy bombers before they reached their targets. It meant that damaged aircraft had a better chance of escaping to friendly territory before their engines failed. It meant that experienced pilots survived longer, accumulating the kill counts and tactical knowledge that would transform them into aces who could train the next generation. But more than these tactical advantages, the modification represented something about American industrial philosophy that the Axis powers had consistently underestimated. It was not just that America produced more aircraft, though the production numbers were staggering, thousands of fighters and bombers rolling from assembly lines every month. It was that America encouraged innovation at every level, that a young mechanic's insight could reshape fleet-wide tactics, that the military hierarchy was flexible enough to recognize good ideas regardless of their source. Japanese aviation development, by contrast, remained centralized and rigid. Engineers in Nagoya and Tokyo designed aircraft according to strict specifications handed down from military leadership. Modifications and improvements moved through layers of bureaucracy, requiring approval from commanders who often lacked technical expertise. Field mechanics were expected to maintain aircraft exactly as delivered, not to innovate or experiment. This approach worked well for preserving consistency and reducing maintenance errors, but it eliminated the possibility of discovering improvements through practical experience. The result was that Japanese fighters like the Zero remained largely unchanged throughout the war, their basic design frozen in 1940 while American aircraft evolved rapidly through thousands of small modifications and continuous refinement. Each improvement, a better propeller pitch curve, a modified gun sight, a strengthened landing gear, represented accumulated battlefield knowledge translated into mechanical advantage. Together, these incremental changes created a growing performance gap that Japanese engineers, no matter how skilled, could not close. German engineers, interviewed after the war, expressed similar frustrations. The Luftwaffe had developed excellent aircraft like the Focke-Wulf FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf-109, but improvements came slowly, hampered by bureaucracy and resource shortages. Field modifications were discouraged unless officially authorized. One German mechanic, captured in 1944, told interrogators about identifying a problem with the Bf-109's fuel injection system that caused engine failures during negative G maneuvers. He developed a simple fix using modified fuel lines. His commanding officer rejected the modification as unauthorized, insisted they wait for official guidance from Messerschmitt. That guidance never came. Pilots continued dying from engine failures that a single mechanic had solved with spare parts and intuition. Charles Stoll's propeller modification became legend not because it was the largest or most dramatic improvement to Allied aircraft. There were larger engines, better guns, revolutionary radar systems, but because it symbolized a fundamental advantage in how American forces approached problems. Every sailor, every soldier, every mechanic was empowered to think, to experiment, to challenge assumptions. This distributed intelligence, multiplied across millions of individuals, created an innovation engine that no centralized authority could match. In August 1943, Stoll was reassigned to Pearl Harbor, promoted to chief mechanic of the Naval Air Technical Training Center, where he taught maintenance procedures to incoming mechanics. He tried to explain his propeller modification in technical terms, but what the students remembered was something simpler, something about paying attention, about listening to what machines were trying to communicate, about trusting your instincts when formal procedures fell short. One student, a kid from Oklahoma who had never seen an ocean before joining the Navy, asked the question they were all thinking. How did you know it would work? Stoll considered this for a long moment, trying to articulate something he had never quite put into words. I didn't know, he finally said, but I knew something was wrong, and I knew roughly what direction the solution might be. Sometimes that's enough. You make the modification carefully, you test it carefully, and you trust that if you're paying attention to the right things, the machine will tell you whether you succeeded. But you could have been wrong, the student pressed. Lieutenant Bauer could have died. Yes, Stoll acknowledged. That risk exists every time someone tries something new. But the risk of doing nothing also exists. How many pilots died because the Corsair wasn't fast enough to escape, wasn't smooth enough to aim properly during a high-speed attack? You balance the risks. Sometimes innovation is safer than stagnation. This philosophy, pragmatic, experimental, willing to challenge authority when evidence demanded it, was uniquely American in a way that transcended simple patriotism. It emerged from a culture that valued individual initiative, that believed ordinary people could solve extraordinary problems, that trusted distributed decision-making more than centralized control. It was the same philosophy that allowed Henry Ford to revolutionize manufacturing, that let the Wright brothers defeat better-funded competitors, that enabled a generation of teenagers to become competent mechanics because they grew up fixing tractors and automobiles on isolated farms. The Axis powers, observing American industrial output from their own centralized systems, often misinterpreted what they were seeing. They saw factories and assumed the advantage was merely quantitative: more workers, more resources, more land. They missed the qualitative difference, the fact that those factories operated with a fundamentally different philosophy about human potential and organizational structure. Every worker was encouraged to suggest improvements. Quality control happened at every stage rather than just at inspection. When problems emerged, solutions came from the people closest to the problem, not from distant managers consulting procedure manuals. This approach was messy, chaotic, sometimes inefficient. But it was also anti-fragile. It got stronger through stress, improved through challenge, evolved through failure. Charles Stoll's propeller modification was just one example among thousands, a single data point in a vast pattern of continuous improvement that occurred across every dimension of American military operations. By 1944, the Corsair had evolved into one of the most feared fighters in the Pacific. Marine squadrons flying from newly captured islands used them to establish air superiority over the Philippines, Okinawa, the approaches to Japan itself. The kill ratio, Corsairs destroyed versus Corsairs lost, climbed to 11:1, then 12:1, then higher as pilot experience accumulated and Japanese opposition weakened. The distinctive inverted gull wings became symbols of American dominance, silhouettes that Japanese ground troops learned to recognize with dread. Pilots who flew the modified Corsairs spoke about them in language usually reserved for living things. The aircraft became extensions of the pilot's will, responsive and powerful, capable of violence and grace in equal measure. Major Gregory Boyington, commanding the famous Black Sheep Squadron, described the sensation of pushing a Corsair through a high-speed dive. You're not controlling the aircraft so much as suggesting directions and watching it respond. At 400 miles per hour, everything happens faster than conscious thought. You react through instinct and training, trusting that the machine will do what you ask. The modified Corsair earned that trust. It never lied, never surprised you with unexpected behavior. It was honest in a way that matters when your life depends on performance. That honesty, that reliability, was Charles Stoll's true achievement. The 50 miles per hour mattered less than the knowledge that the aircraft would perform consistently, that its behavior was predictable, that pilots could push it to its limits without fear that the machine itself would betray them. In combat, where split-second decisions meant the difference between survival and death, that psychological certainty was invaluable. The war ended in August 1945 with Corsairs flying combat air patrols over Tokyo Bay as Japanese officials signed surrender documents aboard the USS Missouri. By then, the F4U had been in continuous production for 3 years, with over 12,000 aircraft delivered to Navy, Marine Corps, and Allied forces. It would remain in production until 1953, eventually becoming the last propeller-driven fighter manufactured in America, an aircraft so successful that it outlasted the era for which it was designed. Charles Stoll mustered out of the Navy in December 1945, returning to Cleveland where he opened a small machine shop specializing in precision fabrication. He rarely spoke about the war, about the propeller modification that had saved countless lives and altered the balance of power in the Pacific. Those who knew him described a quiet man, methodical and careful, someone who listened more than he spoke and who possessed an almost supernatural ability to diagnose mechanical problems through sound and vibration. He died in 1987, largely forgotten except by a small community of aviation historians and Corsair enthusiasts who understood what he had accomplished. There were no monuments, no ships or aircraft named in his honor, no dramatic recognition of the contribution he had made. But in maintenance hangars across America, in technical schools where young mechanics learned their trade, instructors still sometimes told the story of a 24-year-old Navy mechanic who made one of the greatest fighters of World War II 50 miles per hour faster by understanding what the engineers had missed. The deeper truth, the one that transcends this particular story, is about the relationship between authority and innovation, between formal expertise and practical knowledge. The engineers at Vought and Hamilton Standard were not incompetent. They were brilliant, experienced professionals who had designed an remarkable aircraft. But they were constrained by assumptions built into their testing procedures, by optimization criteria that prioritized certain mission profiles over others, by the natural conservatism that comes from working within established systems. Charles Stoll was free from those constraints precisely because he operated outside the formal system. He could experiment because he wasn't bound by institutional procedures. He could take risks because he wasn't protecting a reputation or a career in engineering. His ignorance of certain theoretical constraints allowed him to see possibilities that more knowledgeable people had dismissed as impractical. This pattern repeats throughout history. The Wright brothers succeeded where better-funded, academically credentialed competitors failed because they were bicycle mechanics willing to experiment, rather than academics bound by aeronautical theory. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak created personal computing in a garage because they weren't constrained by IBM's assumptions about what computers should be. The scientific method itself emerged from a deliberate rejection of academic authority in favor of experimental evidence, a philosophical shift that transformed civilization. What makes the American system distinctive is not that it rejects expertise. American universities and research institutions are world-leading centers of knowledge, but that it creates space for challenges to expertise, for practical knowledge to inform theoretical understanding, for innovation to emerge, from unexpected places. This cultural trait, frustrating and chaotic though it may be, generates a competitive advantage that more orderly systems cannot replicate. The Axis powers understood hierarchy and discipline. They built impressive military machines through centralized control and strict adherence to doctrine. But they struggled with adaptation, with the kind of rapid evolution that emerges when millions of individuals are empowered to identify problems and propose solutions. The gap in innovation capacity widened as the war progressed, as American forces accumulated practical knowledge faster than their opponents could adapt to changing circumstances. By 1945, this advantage had become overwhelming. American aircraft were faster, better armed, more reliable. American ships had better radar, better damage control, better logistics. American infantry had better communications, better medical support, better supply chains. None of these advantages came from a single breakthrough or a master plan conceived by brilliant generals. They emerged from thousands of incremental improvements, field modifications, practical solutions to immediate problems, the accumulated wisdom of ordinary people doing extraordinary work under impossible conditions. Charles Stoll's propeller modification was one small part of this larger pattern, a single thread in a vast tapestry of innovation. But it captured something essential about how democracies wage war, about the hidden strength that comes from trusting people to think for themselves, to challenge assumptions, to believe that better solutions might exist if they're willing to search for them. On warm summer evenings in Cleveland, years after the war ended, Charles Stoll would sometimes stand in his machine shop after the other workers had gone home, listening to the hum of idle machinery, the whisper of ventilation systems, the subtle vibrations that spoke of tolerances and tensions invisible to those who hadn't learned to listen. His hands, scarred and calloused from decades of work, would rest against a lathe or a milling machine, feeling the resonance of metal and motion, that same quality of attention he had brought to a propeller in the Solomon Islands when he was 24 years old, and the war hung in balance. He never spoke about what he felt in those moments, never tried to articulate the satisfaction of understanding how things worked, of finding harmony in mechanical systems, of knowing that somewhere in the world, aircraft still flew because he had paid attention when others had accepted limitations as permanent. There was no need for words. The work spoke for itself, in the language of metal and motion, in the vocabulary of force and friction, in the grammar of problems solved and possibilities realized. The propeller that changed the war was ultimately just metal, just aluminum alloy shaped according to equations and constraints. But the insight that transformed it, the recognition that optimal settings existed beyond the boundaries of formal specification, that was human, irreducibly and essentially human. It was the kind of knowledge that emerges not from books or blueprints, but from attention, from curiosity, from the willingness to question what everyone else accepts as fixed reality. Democracy's deepest promise is not merely political, the right to vote, to speak, to assemble. It is epistemological, the belief that truth emerges from distributed inquiry rather than centralized authority, that ordinary people possess insight that experts might miss, that innovation comes from empowering millions of individuals to experiment rather than commanding them to obey. This philosophy made America powerful, not because Americans were smarter or more virtuous than others, but because the system created space for intelligence to emerge from unexpected places, for mechanics to teach engineers, for practical experience to inform theoretical understanding. The 50 miles per hour that Charles Stoll added to the Corsair's maximum speed represented something larger than velocity. It represented a civilization's commitment to the idea that better answers might always exist, that established procedures should be questioned, that the person closest to a problem often sees solutions that distant authorities cannot imagine. It was speed measured not just in miles per hour, but in the rate of innovation, in the velocity of adaptation, in the acceleration of a society that believed its ordinary citizens could solve extraordinary problems if given the freedom and trust to try. That belief, tested in the crucible of war and validated through countless small victories like Stoll's propeller modification, remains the Republic's most valuable inheritance. Not perfection, but the possibility of improvement. Not certainty, but the courage to experiment. Not authority, but the wisdom of distributed intelligence working toward common purpose. The propeller spun and the Corsair flew faster, and in that mechanical transformation lived a truth about human potential that no amount of centralized planning could ever replicate. The war ended. The aircraft were mothballed or scrapped. The pilots came home. But the lesson remained, encoded in maintenance manuals and training curricula, passed from one generation of mechanics to the next. Pay attention. Listen to what machines tell you. Trust your instincts when formal procedures fail. Sometimes the difference between victory and defeat, between life and death, between mediocrity and excellence, comes down to one person willing to believe that better solutions exist and having the courage to search for them. Charles Stoll found that solution on a coral island in the Pacific, beneath canvas stretched tight against tropical wind, his hands black with grease and his mind focused on vibration and pitch and the secret language of metal under stress. He changed the war with a wrench and a stopwatch and an intuition that challenged conventional wisdom. He proved that genius emerges not just from laboratories and universities, but from workshops and maintenance tents, from ordinary people solving immediate problems with whatever tools come to hand. The sun sets over Cleveland, and the machine shop falls silent. Somewhere in the distance, an aircraft passes overhead, its engines humming with the accumulated knowledge of 100 years of aviation, thousands of innovations, Countless mechanics like Charles Stoll who understood that excellence is not a destination but a direction, not a fixed achievement but a continuous pursuit. The propeller spins and the aircraft flies, and in that eternal motion lives the promise of what ordinary people can accomplish when freedom gives them permission to think.